The ice closed in, and two of the most advanced ships Britain had ever built disappeared without a trace. 129 men. Gone. The year was 1845, and the Royal Navy had sent them to crack the Northwest Passage, the last great blank on the map. They never came back. The last Europeans to see the ships alive were whalers in Baffin Bay, who watched them sail north into the summer mist and thought nothing of it. After that, only the Inuit knew what happened, and they told anyone who asked. They described the ships, the ice, the dying men, the desperate march south across terrain that offered nothing. They told the same story, in remarkable detail, for decades. The British didn't believe them. One of the most celebrated writers in England stepped forward to say so publicly, and the Admiralty sent search expedition after search expedition to the wrong places, looking for the wrong thing. The question is why, and what exactly the Inuit said that someone was so determined to discredit. To understand why the silence was so unthinkable, you have to understand what Britain sent north. HMS Erebus and Terror weren't exploration vessels in any ordinary sense. They had been reinforced with iron plating along their bows, fitted with steam engines salvaged from railway locomotives, equipped with desalination equipment, central heating, and a library of over 1,000 books. The Navy had packed their holds with tin provisions, a technology so new it was considered a marvel of modern science. And they'd packed enough of it to last 3 years at sea, which was considered generous, almost excessive. No Arctic expedition in British history had ever left port better prepared. Sir John Franklin was 59 years old and had survived 2 previous Arctic expeditions, including one so brutal his men had eaten their own boot leather to stay alive. The Navy considered him a safe pair of hands, experienced enough to be trusted, famous enough to attract public enthusiasm. When Erebus and Terror sailed from the Thames in May of 1845, there were crowds on the banks to wave them off. The Times ran celebratory coverage. The mood was not anxiety. It was confidence, bordering on inevitability. The Northwest Passage was the last great prize, and Britain was sending its best. 3 years came and went. No word, no ships, nothing. The provisions were gone by 1848 at the latest, and still the Arctic offered nothing back. How does the most prepared expedition in British history simply cease to exist? The Admiralty's answer to silence was ships. More ships, sent north carrying the same assumptions as the ones that had vanished. The first rescue expeditions launched in 1848, 3 years after Franklin sailed, and they went exactly where British naval logic said to look. Wellington Channel, the eastern approaches, the routes that appeared on European maps, drawn mostly from guesswork and previous expeditions that had also, it should be said, gotten lost. What those search parties did not do was ask. There were Inuit communities across the archipelago who had watched Europeans stumble through their territory for decades. They knew the ice. They knew which channels stayed navigable into autumn and which ones closed without warning. They knew the land the way you only know something when your life depends on knowing it every single year. The search parties bypassed the exact channels Inuit hunters used every season as travel routes. Corridors of open water and reliable crossings that don't appear on any Admiralty chart because no Admiralty surveyor had thought to ask for them. Over 30 separate expeditions would eventually go north hunting for Franklin. 30. And the organizing principle behind most of them was European cartography, European assumptions about where a European commander would have gone, which raises a harder question than where the ships sank. What happens when a search is designed not around evidence, but around the pride of the institution doing the searching? John Ray answered that question in 1854, not by sailing to where the Admiralty expected Franklin to be, by listening to people who already knew. Ray was a Hudson's Bay Company surveyor, not Royal Navy, not Admiralty, not part of the institution whose reputation was tied to the search. He traveled light, lived off the land, and he talked to Inuit hunters. That difference in method turned out to be the difference between finding the truth and missing it entirely. In the spring of 1854, near Pelly Bay, Ray met an Inuit man who told him something that stopped him cold. About 4 years earlier, a group of approximately 40 white men had been seen dragging a boat south across the ice. They were thin. They looked desperate. They communicated, through gestures, that their ships had been crushed, that they were trying to walk out. Later that same season, their bodies were found. All of them. The Inuit hadn't just seen them, they'd found what they left behind. Ray collected those objects. and among them was a silver fork, engraved with a crest, Franklin's initials. Physical evidence from men the Inuit said had died on the ice, handed to Ray in the middle of nowhere, 2 years before any Royal Navy ship came close. The ships had vanished, the Inuit had not. They knew where the men went and roughly what happened. The loop was closing. Not through British navigation, but through testimony the British hadn't thought to ask for. What Ray did with that information was straightforward. He came home and told the truth. What the British did with it is a different story entirely. The truth Ray brought home landed in London like a stone through a window. The men were dead. The ships were lost. And the last survivors had, according to Inuit testimony, resorted to cannibalism in their final weeks. That last detail was the match that lit the room. Within weeks, Charles Dickens, the most widely read man in England, the conscience of a nation, the author who had made the Victorian poor feel like human beings, published a 2-part response in his own journal, Household Words. He had not been to the Arctic. He had never met an Inuit person. He cited no evidence beyond his own authority. And he dismissed every word of Inuit testimony as the credulous fantasy of savages incapable of reliable witness. Dickens argued the survivors must have been killed and eaten by the Inuit themselves, not by each other. The alternative, that British naval officers, gentlemen, heroes, could have done such a thing was to him simply unthinkable. So he thought around it. England believed him, not because he had evidence, because he was Dickens. Which raises a question worth sitting with. How does a novelist's opinion carry more weight than an eyewitness account in a formal naval investigation? The answer, it turns out, has nothing to do with the quality of the testimony. It has everything to do with who was allowed to count as a witness in the first place. So, what did the witnesses actually say? Not the summary of the summary, not Dickens's paraphrase. The testimony itself, recorded by John Ray in 1854 and cross-checked against later expeditions that collected the same accounts independently, years apart from people who had never met. The Inuit described 2 ships. One had sunk in deep water. The other had been crushed by ice and gone down in shallower coastal waters to the west of King William Island. They described the direction the surviving men were walking, south toward the Back River, and roughly how many there were. They described a boat dragged overland on a sledge, with bodies still inside it. They described a tent on the shore with more dead. The details were specific enough to be wrong. That's the point. Vague mythology doesn't specify which ship sank where, or what direction the men were marching, or how the ice took one vessel differently than the other. What makes this harder to dismiss is what happened when later searchers, Francis McClintock in 1859, Frederick Schwatka in 1879, went back and asked again. Different Inuit communities, questioned separately, across a span of 25 years, gave accounts that aligned on the ship positions, the direction of travel, and the location of the final camp. That kind of convergence doesn't come from rumor. Rumors drift. These didn't, which leaves a question that the record never cleanly answers. If the accounts were this precise, why were they filed away as mythology? Because the accounts threatened something, not just a reputation, a story that Britain had already decided to tell about itself. Jane Franklin understood this better than anyone. She had spent years cultivating her husband's image as a hero of empire, and when the reports came back from the Arctic in 1854, the ones that included Ray's testimony, the Inuit accounts, the starvation, the cannibalism, she did not accept them. She funded her own search, not to find the truth, to find a better one. The expedition she financed, led by Francis McClintock, sailed in 1857 and returned in 1859. And it found something Ray's overland journey never had: physical evidence. A stone cairn on King William Island. Inside it, a single sheet of paper. The document was a standard Admiralty form, filled in twice. The first entry, dated May 1847, noted the ships were doing well. The second entry, crammed in the margins a year later, told a different story entirely. Both ships had been beset in ice since April 1848. Franklin was dead. 24 other officers and men were dead. The surviving crew was abandoning the vessels and marching south. One sheet of paper, the only written record that came back from the expedition. And the date on it, 1848, matched what the Inuit had already said. The question of when the ships were lost, when the men began to walk, when everything collapsed. The timeline was closing. The timeline was closing, but one part of John Ray's 1854 report had nothing to do with ships or dates or navigation. It was a single detail buried in the Inuit testimony that would determine, more than anything else, whether the British establishment chose to believe any of it. The Inuit had told Ray that in the final weeks, the surviving men had eaten the bodies of the dead. Ray included this in his official report. He had to. It came from multiple independent accounts, described with the same specificity as the rest of the testimony. But the moment it was published, the reaction in London was not grief, and it was not investigation. It was fury. Charles Dickens, the most widely read voice in England, wrote a lengthy rebuttal arguing that the Inuit must be lying, or worse, that the Inuit themselves were responsible for the men's deaths. The testimony was dismissed, not because it was unverifiable, but because what it described was intolerable. Here is what happened when scientists finally reached King William Island, with the tools to look properly. Bones recovered from the site showed cut marks. Careful, deliberate cut marks in patterns consistent with the removal of flesh. The forensic analysis was unambiguous. The detail that had been called the most unbelievable, the claim used to discredit everything else the Inuit had said, turned out to be the most precisely confirmed thing in the entire record. Which raises a question that doesn't resolve cleanly. What does it mean that the testimony considered least credible was the testimony the physical evidence confirmed most exactly? The Inuit had been right about the ships, they had been right about the timeline, and they had been right about this. That confirmation didn't arrive in 1854. It arrived more than a century later. And in the space between, something worth examining happened, or rather didn't happen. Dozens of expeditions returned to the Arctic between Ray's report in the late 20th century. They carried better equipment with every passing decade. Stronger ships, aerial surveys, eventually sonar and satellite. What most of them did not carry was any sustained engagement with the people who had been living in that landscape for generations, the people who had already told the story once. One expedition in the 1930s spent 3 full seasons working the region. 3 seasons is a serious commitment, and in at least one documented instance, Inuit community members offered oral directions, specific guidance about where to look. The expedition declined to follow up. They found nothing. That's not an isolated failure of curiosity. It's a pattern, and patterns have explanations. The easiest explanation, that researchers simply didn't know the Inuit had relevant knowledge, stops working when you look at the record. Ray's report had been published. The testimony was there. The choice to look past it was a choice, which means the century of failed searches tells us something beyond bad luck. It tells us what happens when an entire knowledge system gets written off at the source. Not once, but repeatedly, by expedition after expedition, generation after generation. Not an oversight, a structure. That structure didn't collapse on its own. It took deliberate work to dismantle it, and that work began in earnest when Parks Canada and the Inuit Heritage Trust formed a formal partnership in the early 2000s to search for the Franklin wrecks together. Not as a courtesy, not with Indigenous knowledge filed somewhere in the appendix. As co-investigators, with Inuit oral accounts treated as primary evidence, weighted the same as archival charts and naval records. The shift sounds simple. It wasn't. It meant re-examining testimony that the British establishment had spent 150 years quietly sidelining. Accounts from hunters, from elders, passed down through communities who had lived and traveled the Central Arctic for generations. Knowledge that was precise, geographically grounded, and internally consistent across sources who had never coordinated their stories because they didn't need to. They'd seen it. When researchers mapped those accounts onto the actual landscape, a pattern emerged that the old expedition charts had never produced. Inuit oral tradition pointed repeatedly and specifically to Victoria Strait, the same body of water that every major previous expedition had deprioritized, looked past, or dismissed as too remote a candidate. The wreck of a century of failure wasn't bad luck. It was a compass pointing the wrong direction on purpose. The question now was whether the wrecks would actually be there, exactly where Inuit tradition had said they would be all along. They were there, both of them. In September 2014, A Parks Canada Marine Survey located HMS Erebus on the seafloor of Victoria Strait, precisely the body of water that Inuit accounts had described, specifically and repeatedly, for 160 years. 2 years later, in 2016, HMS Terror was found in a sheltered inlet to the south. The location had a name. It had always had a name. Inuit communities called it Terror Bay, not because anyone had searched there, not because any chart had marked it as significant, but because they had always known a ship was there. The bay was named for the wreck before the modern world knew the wreck existed. That detail is worth sitting with, not a general region, not a rough bearing. A named bay carrying the memory of a specific ship passed down through oral tradition across generations, confirmed the moment divers reached the bottom. The master loop closes here. The ships are where Inuit said they would be, not approximately, not in the same general area, there. But the wrecks didn't just confirm the location. What archaeologists found inside the hulls, the state of the ships, the objects left behind, the evidence of how they were abandoned, opened a harder question about what actually happened in those final months. And on that question, Inuit testimony has things to say that no expedition ever bothered to record carefully enough. The wrecks confirmed the where. What they couldn't immediately answer was the how, the sequence of decisions that left 2 Royal Navy ships sitting on the seafloor of Victoria Strait and Terror Bay. Erebus showed what you'd expect from a vessel abandoned in crisis, objects scattered, compartments in disarray. The physical signature of people leaving in a hurry, taking what they could carry and leaving the rest. Terror was different. When archaeologists entered the hull, they found it in remarkable condition, hatches closed, drawers shut, supplies still stored in something close to order. The ship hadn't been abandoned to chaos. It looked, in certain ways, like it had been prepared, preserved, almost deliberately. There is an Inuit account, collected and largely set aside, that describes men returning to one of the ships after the main body had already left, reboarding it, spending time aboard. The condition of terror fits that account more closely than it fits the official story of a single mass abandonment in April 1848, which puts archaeology and oral tradition back in the same conversation, not as antagonists, but as sources that need each other. The wrecks answered the location question definitively. On the question of what happened next, they opened as much as they closed. And that gap between what objects can tell us and what only witnessed accounts preserve is exactly where Inuit knowledge still has work to do. The question now isn't whether that testimony deserves a hearing. It's whether the institutions doing the archaeology are positioned to actually listen. The institutions are the right place to end. Because this story was never really about the ice, or the ships, or even the men who died on them. It was about who gets to be a credible witness to history. The Inuit never stopped telling this story. For 160 years, the accounts circulated, through families, through communities, through the same oral tradition that had preserved everything else they needed to survive in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. They did not forget. They did not revise the story to make it more palatable. They told it, and told it, and told it. The British stopped listening. That is the asymmetry at the center of this entire history. Not that the knowledge was unavailable. Ray published it in 1854. Not that it was ambiguous. Multiple independent witnesses described the same ships, the same direction, the same end. The knowledge existed. It was simply refused. The difference between those two facts, one people preserving, another people dismissing, is the whole film. What would structural change actually look like? It means Indigenous testimony entering the evidentiary record not as color or corroboration, but as primary source material with its own protocols, its own chain of custody, its own standards, ones developed with the communities who hold it, not imposed on them. The credibility gap that let Ray's findings get buried, the century of silence that followed, the question of why 2 steel wrecks in shallow Arctic water took until 2014 to locate when people had been pointing at that water for generations. These are not separate puzzles. They are the same failure repeated. A civilization so confident in its own instruments that it forgot instruments are only as good as the questions you allow yourself to ask. The Franklin expedition did not vanish. We knew where it ended for over a century. We simply refused to accept who was telling us. The Inuit accounts weren't vague legend. They named specific locations, described the direction the men marched, noted the condition of the bodies. John Ray forwarded that testimony to London in 1854 and was effectively run out of polite society for it. Charles Dickens published a rebuttal in his own magazine, arguing that Arctic savages were too unreliable to be believed. This was the considered judgment of Victorian England's most famous novelist, and it stuck. The Admiralty redirected search efforts north and east, away from King William Island for decades. The problem was never really with the evidence. It's with what we chose to believe, and what that choice cost, measured not in ships, but in the 160 years we spent looking in the wrong direction.